The moment my own son told me I was nothing more than a burden, it felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath my feet. He looked me straight in the eyes, the same eyes I once held as a newborn, and dismissed me as if I were just an inconvenience in his carefully curated life. I had buried my husband not even 2 years earlier, and now I was being buried again, but this time under the weight of my own family's betrayal. I'm Linda Miller, 70 years old, a widow, and a mother who thought love and sacrifice meant something. I spent decades holding my family together, quietly giving away pieces of myself so they could live comfortably. But in that single instant, standing in my own kitchen, I realized how disposable I had become to the people I had sacrificed everything for. It wasn't just the words. It was the coldness behind them. The way he folded his arms like a gatekeeper, barring me from the life I thought I belonged to. His wife stood nearby, lips curled in that practiced smile that always carried more judgment than kindness. I had been told, in the most unceremonious way, that I was no longer welcome. Not in their home, not in their plans, not even in their hearts. My chest burned as though all those years of loyalty, patience, and faithfulness had been nothing but a foolish investment. I had given up vacations so he could go to summer camps. I had skipped meals so there'd be enough for his school supplies. I had held my husband's hand through double shifts so we could pay for his college. And yet, here I was cast aside as if none of it mattered. The humiliation was sharper than any knife, to be treated like an obligation, like a problem to be solved rather than a mother to be cherished. Loneliness pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, but beneath it all, there was something else. A quiet ember of outrage, one I had ignored for too long. Because this wasn't the beginning of the story. No. This was just the breaking point. The betrayal you've just heard was years in the making, built from smaller cruelties and subtle dismissals. And if you stay with me, I'll take you back through the journey, the sacrifices, the exploitation, the unspoken truths that led me to this moment. Only then will you understand why this wound cut so deep, and why I could never go back to who I was before. When I look back on my life, I sometimes wonder if I made a mistake in believing that love and sacrifice would be enough to hold a family together. From the day my son, David, was born, everything I did revolved around him. I worked 2 jobs while my husband pulled double shifts, just so we could afford a small house in a safe neighborhood. Vacations were rare, but I never complained. Instead of beaches or fancy resorts, we spent our summers fixing up the house, turning it into a home where David could feel safe and proud. I remember staying up late at the kitchen table, helping him with school projects long after my eyes begged for rest. I packed lunches every morning, made sure his uniforms were always pressed, and somehow found the energy to cheer him on at his baseball games. I wanted him to grow up knowing he was supported, knowing that someone believed in him without condition. Every birthday, every milestone, I put his happiness first, even if it meant putting my own needs last. When my husband passed away, I thought at least I'd still have my son as my anchor. I imagined he'd visit often, bring the grandchildren around, maybe call me just to check in. For a while, he did. Those early years after his father's death, he seemed attentive, concerned. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance began to shift. It started with small requests. Could I help with a down payment on his first house? Of course I could. I wanted to see him and his wife, Karen, settled and happy. Then came the private school tuition for their daughter, Emily. Public schools, Karen insisted, were not good enough. I paid it willingly, telling myself it was for my granddaughter's future. But over time, those requests stopped feeling like requests. They became expectations, obligations. My modest savings, carefully built over decades of frugal living, dwindled piece by piece. When I hesitated, Karen would give me that smile, tight, polished. A smile that was less gratitude and more calculation. She had a way of making me feel guilty, as if I were being selfish for wanting to keep a little for myself. And David, my sweet boy, he never stopped her. He stood by her side, nodding in agreement, telling me it was just practical or temporary. He spoke in that careful tone he always used when he wanted something but didn't want to admit it outright. I told myself he was caught between loyalty to me and loyalty to his wife, but the truth was harder to swallow. He had grown comfortable with my sacrifices. It wasn't just about money. There were humiliations, subtle at first. At family dinners, Karen would dismiss my cooking, suggesting caterers or restaurants instead. She laughed once, in front of guests, that I was useless at these parties, though she called it a joke. No one touched the pies I baked, preferring the glossy cakes she bought from the bakery. My place in their lives shifted from mother and grandmother to background decoration there, but unnoticed. The more I gave, the less I seemed to matter. Every contribution was absorbed without thanks, and every silence on my part was taken as agreement. I started to feel invisible in my own family. My sacrifices, once acts of love, had been transformed into obligations, expected and unappreciated. Each time I left their house after one of these dinners, I drove home with my chest tight, gripping the steering wheel just to steady myself. The city lights blurred as I tried to hold back tears, realizing I wasn't seen as a mother anymore. I was a resource, a safety net, someone they could lean on but never truly respect. And with each passing year, the weight grew heavier. I told myself to endure it, that love required patience. But patience had turned into silence, and silence had turned into submission. Something inside me began to shift, a quiet tension building that I could no longer ignore. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about helping my son. This was about being used, and sooner or later, something would have to break. The night it all came crashing down didn't start out differently from any other. I had gone over to David and Karen's house to help watch Emily while they attended some charity gala. Babysitting my granddaughter had always been the highlight of those visits. She was pure joy, innocent, curious, still untainted by the coldness of her parents' world. For a few hours, I could forget the tension and just be grandma. But when they returned late that evening, tired and tipsy, I lingered in the kitchen to clean up. I wasn't supposed to hear what I heard. Their voices carried through the thin walls as they settled into the living room. At first, it was laughter sharp, careless laughter that stung in ways they couldn't imagine. And then, I heard my name. Karen's voice, cool and dismissive, floated down the hall. She was saying how exhausting it was having me around, how I was useful for childcare and money, but impossible to live with full time. She joked that they should start charging me rent whenever I stayed over, since I ate their food and used their water. Her words cut deep, not because of the insult itself, but because of how casually she said it, as though my worth could be measured in utilities and grocery bills. I waited for David to defend me, to say, "That's my mother you're talking about," but instead, I heard him sigh and agree. He said that keeping me close was practical, especially since I always chipped in financially. "She's basically our safety net," he added. "We'd be drowning in debt without her." That was when the world tilted. Debt. I had no idea they were struggling to that extent. I thought my contributions, the tuition, the down payment, the countless checks were extras, not lifelines. But from the sound of his voice, I realized my generosity had been propping up an entire facade. Their grand home, the luxury cars, the image of success they had been built on my back. I froze there in the kitchen, holding a damp dish towel, my hands trembling. My son, my only son, saw me not as a mother, not as a human being with feelings and limits, but as a resource, a bank account with legs. The laughter that followed, light and dismissive, was the final twist of the knife. I wanted to storm into that living room, to confront them then and there, but something inside me stopped. Instead, I stood silently, heart pounding, letting the truth wash over me in waves of shock and pain. I felt the years of sacrifice unravel before my eyes, every late-night shift, every dollar saved, every moment I put their needs ahead of my own. It had all been reduced to a calculation, a ledger entry, a transaction. For a long moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the kitchen floor. My chest ached with a heaviness I could barely carry. But beneath that pain, beneath the humiliation, something else began to stir. A spark, a quiet, simmering ember of resolve. Because if this was how they saw me, if decades of devotion could be dismissed so easily, then I had no choice but to see them for who they truly were. No illusions, no excuses, no more blind hope that things would change on their own. That night, as I drove home under the streetlights, tears streaking my face, I felt something inside me harden. The truth had finally revealed itself, brutal and undeniable. And though it broke my heart, it also set me free in a way I hadn't expected. I would no longer be their silent safety net. I would no longer let my life be dictated by their greed. They thought they had me cornered, but they had underestimated the strength that comes from a mother's love and a widow's survival. And as painful as that night was, it marked the beginning of a shift, one that would change everything. In the days that followed, I carried their words with me like a wound I couldn't stop touching. Every time I replayed that conversation in my mind, the sting sharpened. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized pain wasn't the only thing I felt. There was also clarity. And clarity, I've learned, can be the beginning of power. That week, while sorting through old files in my desk, I stumbled on an envelope tucked inside one of my husband's leather-bound journals. My hands shook as I pulled it free. It was a letter, written in his careful handwriting, addressed to me. He must have written it before he passed, perhaps knowing I'd eventually need it. Inside was not only his words of love and reassurance, but also documentation statements from an account I hadn't known existed. A savings account, in my name, with nearly $5,000 sitting untouched. I remember sitting at that desk, staring at the numbers, feeling the weight of decades lift from my shoulders. My husband had prepared for this. He must have suspected that life after him would not be kind, that I'd need something to protect me when the world, or even my own family, turned against me. The realization filled me with both sorrow and gratitude. He was gone, but his love still shielded me. For the first time in years, I felt steady again. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't at their mercy. I had options. And so, I began to plan, not recklessly, not in anger, but with a cool, deliberate patience. I made lists, gathered documents, researched places where I could live independently and comfortably. I even reached out to a trusted lawyer, one who had guided us through estate planning years before. Every move was quiet, invisible, hidden behind the mask of the dutiful mother they thought they still controlled. Meanwhile, David and Karen grew bolder. They talked openly about my situation, as if my future were theirs to decide. One afternoon, Karen casually mentioned that it might be time for me to consider assisted living, a beautiful community she had researched. She painted it as a gift me surrounded by people my age, free from responsibilities. But I saw the calculation in her eyes. She wasn't offering me freedom. She was offering herself freedom from me. David, too, played his role. He reminded me of how difficult things could be if I lived alone, hinting that the house was too much for me to handle. He spoke about consolidating finances, about how much simpler it would be if I let them manage my accounts. He believed I was vulnerable, too tired or too naive to see through his words. And that was the second twist. They thought they were tightening their grip. They believed they were steering me into dependence, when in truth, I was already holding the keys to my own escape. They mistook my silence for weakness. But silence can also be strategy. At night, when I lay in bed, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would reveal the truth at just the right moment. Not too early, not when they could still twist the story to their advantage, but at the perfect time, when their confidence was at its peak and their guard was down. I wanted them to see the walls of their false security crumble, to realize that the very woman they underestimated had been planning her own liberation right under their noses. Every smile I gave them, every nod of agreement, became part of the performance. And oh, how convinced they were. They strutted through their days, discussing renovations, vacations, future investments as though my supposed dependency guaranteed their comfort. They didn't know that their lifeline was already cut, that I was days away from reclaiming every ounce of dignity they had stripped from me. I was no longer afraid. The fear had burned away, replaced with something sharper, something stronger: patience, control, resolve. The stage was being set. They thought they were preparing to move me into a smaller life, boxed in and dependent. But what they didn't know was that I was preparing, too preparing for the day I would step into the light with my truth and watch as their carefully constructed world unraveled. The confrontation was coming, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself not dreading the future, but anticipating it. The day of reckoning came sooner than I expected. Karen had called me into the dining room one Saturday morning, spreading papers across the polished table as if she were hosting a board meeting. David sat beside her, his hands folded, his expression rehearsed. They had decided, they told me, that it was time for me to transition into assisted living. They spoke as though the choice had already been made, their voices dripping with authority, as if I were a child incapable of deciding my own future. I listened quietly, my hands resting on the arms of the chair, my face calm. Inside, though, I was steady in a way I hadn't been in years. I knew something they didn't. When Karen finished her pitch, her lips curved into that same thin smile she always wore when she thought she had won. David nodded in agreement, adding that it was for the best and that they'd already begun researching financial arrangements. He hinted at needing access to my accounts to make the transition smooth. That was when I leaned forward, slid a small folder across the table, and said softly, "I think you should see this first." Karen frowned, but curiosity got the better of her. She opened the folder and froze. David glanced over her shoulder, and the color drained from his face. Inside were copies of account statements, my account, not theirs, showing the inheritance my husband had left for me. $500,000 sitting untouched, under my name alone. The silence was heavy. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, David stammered something about helping me manage it responsibly, but his voice shook, his mask slipping. I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "You've been using me as your safety net," I said. "All this time. I thought I was helping my family, but what I've really been doing is carrying the weight of your debt. I know about it, David. I know the cars, the vacations, the house, all of it is built on money you don't have." Karen tried to protest, but her voice faltered. She shifted in her seat, her composure cracking. I watched the panic ripple across her face, the way her hands gripped the papers like she could somehow make the truth disappear. And then came the final twist. I pulled out a second document, this one prepared by my lawyer. It was proof that I had already made arrangements to move into a new apartment at a senior community of my choosing. Not only was I no longer dependent on them, I was removing myself from their lives entirely. No more checks, no more childcare, no more quiet compliance. David's jaw tightened. Karen's eyes filled with a mixture of rage and fear. They had counted on me forever being in their pocket, quietly funding their life. And in one moment, I cut the cord. "You thought you were managing me?" I said, my voice steady. "But the truth is, I've been preparing to free myself from you. And from this day forward, you'll stand on your own. I won't be your safety net anymore." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I stood, gathering my folder and tucking it under my arm. They sat there stunned, unable to speak, as though their entire world had shifted beneath them. For me, though, the air felt lighter. My steps felt firmer. I had come into that dining room as the woman they believed they controlled. I walked out as the woman who had taken her life back. And for the first time in years, I felt triumphant. It's been months since that morning in the dining room, and my life feels like it belongs to me again. I now live in a small but beautiful apartment in a senior community where I have neighbors who smile when they pass by, and evenings filled with laughter, games, and stories instead of silence and guilt. For the first time in years, I wake up without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing on my chest. I've learned something powerful through all of this. Family should never be measured by what you can give them financially, or by how much you're willing to sacrifice. True family is built on love, respect, and gratitude. When those things disappear, what you're left with is exploitation dressed up as obligation. And the moment you recognize that, you also recognize the choice to step away. It hasn't been easy letting go of the version of my son I once believed in. That loss aches in ways I can't put into words. But there is peace in knowing I honored myself, that I drew a line and reclaimed the dignity I nearly lost. I no longer live as someone's safety net. I live as myself, a woman who survived, who endured, and who finally found freedom. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I want you to hear me clearly. It is never too late to stand up for yourself. You are not too old, too weak, or too dependent to demand respect. Your voice matters. And if my story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Let others know they're not alone. And if you believe in stories of resilience and justice, don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes the truth we share is the first step to healing.